The town of Hollow Creek was known for its fog-covered shores and historic mansions, where stories of old New England hauntings had become part of the local charm. Dr. Ethan Parker, a young and promising neurosurgeon from Boston, had just arrived in this quaint town to take up a position at the Hollow Creek Medical Center. He was looking forward to the peace and quiet of small-town life after years of fast-paced living in the city. Ethan had rented a large colonial-style house at the edge of town. The house, known as Whitman Manor, had been vacant for several years and carried a certain mystique. Locals whispered about strange happenings, but Ethan dismissed them as old superstitions, just part of the town's eerie atmosphere. One evening, Ethan decided to drive out along the coast, hoping to explore the area and enjoy the scenic beauty of the rocky cliffs that bordered the Atlantic Ocean. The road was isolated, barely lit, and shrouded in a thick fog that rolled in from the sea. As Ethan carefully navigated the winding turns, he suddenly saw a figure in white standing in the middle of the road. Startled, he slammed on the brakes, his car screeching to a halt just inches away from the mysterious woman. She was dressed in an old-fashioned white gown, her face pale and expressionless. For a moment they stared at each other, her eyes empty, yet hauntingly beautiful. Without a word, the woman began walking away, disappearing into the fog that blanketed the cliffs. Ethan, confused and curious, stepped out of his car, calling after her. But she was gone. He searched the area for any signs of her, wondering if she had been hurt or lost. All he could find were footprints leading toward the edge of the cliffs, and then nothing. Shaken by the encounter, Ethan drove back to town, convinced that he had seen a ghost or at the very least a hallucination. He tried to dismiss it as stress or fatigue, but the image of the woman in white lingered in his mind. The next day, Ethan began hearing more about the mysterious woman. While discussing his encounter with a colleague, Dr. Madeline Foster, she seemed oddly intrigued. "You've seen her?" she asked, her voice low. "They say she appears to people who are searching for something or someone. No one knows who she is, but she's been seen for years." Ethan brushed it off as local legend, but the sense of unease grew. Soon, strange things started happening around his house. The door to his attic creaked open on its own. Objects in his home seemed to move by themselves, and every night he heard a faint knocking sound, always around midnight. One night, unable to sleep, Ethan heard the knock again, louder this time. He followed the sound to his front door, and there, standing outside in the misty night, was the woman in white. Her gaze was locked on him, her expression more desperate than before. Without thinking, Ethan stepped outside. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling, but she didn't answer. She turned and walked away again, leading him toward the cliffs. Ethan followed, compelled by an unknown force, the fog growing thicker as they reached the edge of the cliffs. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, the woman vanished into the night. Ethan returned home, deeply disturbed. Who was she? Why did she keep appearing to him? As he tried to piece together the mystery, he realized something chilling. The woman was not just a ghost. She was trying to tell him something. But what? Over the next few days, Ethan's obsession with the woman in white grew. He began researching the history of Whitman Manor and the town itself. He discovered that years ago, a young woman had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Her name was Clara Whitman, the last known resident of his house. People believed she had drowned, but her body was never found. And as he dug deeper into the town's history, Ethan started to wonder if Clara's spirit was still searching for answers, and if she was connected to him in ways he couldn't yet understand. Little did Ethan know, this was only the beginning of a dark and twisted mystery that would unravel his life and blur the lines between the living and the dead. Begins. Ethan Parker couldn't shake the unsettling presence of the woman in white. Days passed, but Clara Whitman's ghostly figure haunted his thoughts and dreams, her cold gaze burning into his mind. He felt a strange connection to her, as if she was trying to tell him something important, something he couldn't yet understand. His once quiet life in Hollow Creek was slowly becoming consumed by the mystery of Clara Whitman and her tragic disappearance. Determined to uncover the truth, Ethan threw himself into research. Late nights were spent poring over old newspaper clippings, town records, and forgotten letters. The more he dug into Hollow Creek's past, the more he realized how deeply Clara's disappearance had affected the town. There were rumors of scandal, betrayal, and death. Whitman Manor, his own house, had been at the center of it all. As Ethan's obsession deepened, strange things continued to happen around him. Every night, at exactly midnight, the same soft knocking echoed through his house, always coming from the front door. No matter how many times he checked, there was never anyone there. Lights flickered, shadows danced in the corners of rooms, and sometimes in the dead of night he swore he could hear the faint sound of a woman crying. One night, exhausted from lack of sleep and weighed down by frustration, Ethan decided to visit the local library, hoping to uncover more about the Whitman family. The librarian, Mrs. Agnes Moore, was an elderly woman who had lived in Hollow Creek her entire life. When Ethan asked her about the Whitmans, her face darkened. "You're living in that house?" she asked, her voice low, eyes narrowing behind her glasses. "I would have thought twice about that, young man. The Whitman family's cursed. Everyone who's lived in that house since Clara disappeared has met a tragic end." Ethan leaned in, intrigued but skeptical. "What happened to Clara?" Mrs. Moore hesitated, glancing around as if making sure no one was listening. Clara was engaged to be married. A wealthy man from New York, Lucas Fairchild, had come to Hollow Creek to expand his shipping business, and he'd taken a liking to her. But people said she was in love with someone else, a local boy, a painter named Henry Carlyle. Her father forbade the relationship, but Clara kept seeing him in secret. Ethan nodded, pieces of the puzzle slowly falling into place. "So what happened to Henry?" "He disappeared the same night Clara did," Mrs. Moore whispered. "Some say they ran away together. Others say Lucas found out and had him killed. But no one ever found Henry's body. And Clara, well, people believe she drowned, but I've never been so sure." There's more to the story than people think. Ethan left the library with more questions than answers. If Clara hadn't drowned, what had happened to her? And why was she haunting him now? That night, as he sat in the eerie silence of Whitman Manor, flipping through an old diary he had found in the attic, the air grew cold. The clock struck midnight, and the familiar knocking began, soft and rhythmic. This time, Ethan didn't hesitate. He flung open the door, and there she was again. Clara stood on the porch, her white gown flowing in the wind, her eyes filled with sorrow and urgency. She raised her hand, pointing toward the attic. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He had been up there several times, but had never found anything unusual, except for the dusty old boxes of family belongings. With a trembling hand, Ethan followed her silent command. He climbed the creaking stairs to the attic, the air growing colder with every step. The woman in white hovered at the edge of his vision, guiding him toward a large, antique mirror covered with a sheet. He hadn't noticed it before, tucked away behind the old trunks and furniture. Ethan yanked off the sheet, revealing the dusty surface of the mirror. As he wiped it clean, a reflection appeared, one that wasn't his own. It was Clara, staring back at him with a pleading expression, her lips moving soundlessly. Behind her, he saw the faint outline of a man, a figure shrouded in darkness. Suddenly, a gust of wind rushed through the attic, though the windows were closed. The mirror rattled violently in its frame, and Ethan heard a voice, distant and echoing, but unmistakable. "Help me." Ethan staggered back, his heart racing. He knew now that Clara's spirit wasn't just haunting him. She needed him to uncover the truth of what had happened to her and Henry that fateful night. But why him? Why now? Desperate for answers, Ethan reached out to Dr. Madeline Foster, his colleague at the medical center, who had expressed interest in the legend of the Whitman family. Over coffee, Ethan shared everything: the sightings, the knocking, the attic mirror. Madeline listened carefully, her face pale but composed. "There's a connection between you and Clara," she said thoughtfully. "I don't know what it is yet, but you're linked to her somehow. Maybe it's the house, or maybe..." She trailed off, as if hesitant to speak her next thought. "Maybe what?" Ethan pressed. "Maybe you're a part of her unfinished story," Madeline replied softly. "Clara's spirit is still here because her story isn't over. She wants justice, or maybe she just wants peace." Ethan's mind raced. Could Clara's spirit be trapped, reliving the events of her death until someone set her free? He needed more answers, and fast. But as the days passed, the haunting grew more intense. The woman in white began appearing not just at night, but during the day. Always watching, always silent. Her presence filled every corner of his life like a shadow that wouldn't leave. One evening, as he walked through the fog-covered streets of Hollow Creek, Ethan felt the weight of her gaze on him. He turned, and there she was, standing at the end of the street, motioning for him to follow her once again, toward the cliffs where it had all begun. This time, Ethan knew he couldn't ignore her. The truth about Clara Whitman was out there, waiting to be uncovered, and it was leading him toward something far darker than he ever imagined. The fog clung to Hollow Creek streets as Ethan stood at the edge of the cliffs, the woman in white just beyond the mist. Her figure seemed to blend into the rolling fog, but her message was clear. She was leading him toward the truth, and it lay somewhere in these cliffs. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he felt the pull of her presence, stronger now than it had ever been. He reached out into the mist, his hand grasping nothing but cold air. Clara turned and drifted toward the jagged rocks below, vanishing into the dense fog. Ethan knew this was the spot, the place where Clara's life had ended. He had been here before, looking out at the sea, but now it felt different. The energy in the air was charged, as if the cliffs themselves were haunted by the memory of what had happened. Ethan stepped closer to the edge, peering down at the crashing waves. He could almost picture it. A dark night, the wind howling, and Clara standing on the edge, perhaps desperate and betrayed, or maybe not alone. He recalled the man's shadow he had seen in the mirror. Was it Henry Carlisle, or had Lucas Fairchild been responsible for her fall? As Ethan stood lost in thought, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Dr. Madeline Foster. Found something you need to see. Meet me at Whitman Manor. Back at the manor, Madeline greeted Ethan with a stack of old papers and photos. I went through the archives, she said, her eyes wide with excitement. There's more to Clara's story than we thought, and it involves Lucas Fairchild and Henry Carlisle. She spread out the documents on the table. Ethan scanned the articles, his breath catching in his throat as he read the details. Lucas Fairchild, Clara's fiancé, had been a powerful and controlling man, used to getting his way. But Clara's heart had belonged to Henry, the local painter. The town gossips had whispered about their affair, and according to Madeline's findings, Lucas had found out just days before Clara's disappearance. There were reports of a confrontation between Lucas and Henry, Madeline said, pointing to a yellowed article. Witnesses said they heard shouting coming from Whitman Manor the night before Clara vanished. Ethan leaned in, studying an old photograph of Lucas Fairchild. His eyes were cold, sharp, calculating. He had the look of a man who wouldn't tolerate betrayal. So Lucas might have had something to do with Clara's death, Ethan muttered, piecing together the timeline. He finds out about Henry, they argue, and then Clara disappears. Madeline nodded, but there was more. I also found something else. Lucas wasn't the only one who confronted Henry that night. Ethan looked up, confused. What do you mean? Henry received a letter that night, supposedly from Clara, asking him to meet her by the cliffs, but the handwriting didn't match hers. Madeline handed Ethan a faded letter. Someone lured Henry out there, and they never saw him again. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. Do you think Lucas wrote the letter? Madeline shrugged, but her expression was grim. It's possible. If Lucas wanted to get rid of Henry, what better way than to make him think Clara wanted to meet him? Maybe he planned to kill Henry and Clara got caught in the crossfire. Later that night, Ethan couldn't shake the weight of what he had learned. As he walked through Whitman Manor's dimly lit halls, the house seemed more alive than ever, its walls echoing with the secrets it had held for so long. Clara's presence felt stronger, more urgent. He could feel her watching, waiting for him to uncover the final pieces of the puzzle. At midnight, the knocking started again, 3 slow, deliberate taps. Ethan's heart raced as he approached the front door, but this time he didn't open it. Instead, he listened, waiting for the next sign. The house groaned in the silence, the shadows shifting around him. Suddenly, the faint sound of footsteps echoed from above, the attic. Ethan grabbed a flashlight and made his way up the creaking stairs. The air grew colder as he reached the attic, the familiar sense of dread creeping in. But this time, he was ready. He knew Clara was leading him here for a reason. As he entered the attic, the mirror he had uncovered days before caught his eye. Its surface shimmered in the dim light, reflecting the dusty room around him. He stepped closer, his breath fogging the glass, and then he saw her. Clara appeared in the mirror, her ghostly figure clearer than ever. She looked at him with pleading eyes, her hand reaching out. Ethan watched as her lips moved, mouthing the same words he had heard before. "Help me." But this time, she pointed towards something behind him. Ethan turned, his flashlight sweeping across the attic. In the far corner, hidden beneath an old pile of blankets and crates, was a wooden chest, one he hadn't noticed before. His heart raced as he pulled the chest free, brushing off the layers of dust. The lock was old and rusted, but it gave way with a sharp twist. Inside, Ethan found a stack of letters from Clara to Henry. Each one was filled with love, longing, and desperation. But there was one letter, different from the rest, written in a trembling hand. Ethan's eyes widened as he read the final words. "Henry, I fear for my life. Lucas knows about us and he's dangerous. Please meet me at the cliffs tonight. I need to see you before it's too late. Love, Clara." It was the letter Henry had received, but now in Clara's own hand. She had been the one to ask him to the cliffs that night, not Lucas. But why? Before Ethan could process the revelation, the temperature in the attic plummeted. Clara's figure grew more solid, her face twisted in sorrow. She mouthed one final word. Lucas. In that moment, Ethan understood. Clara hadn't gone to the cliffs that night to run away with Henry. She had gone to warn him. But Lucas had followed them both, and in a jealous rage, he had killed them. Clara had been pushed from the cliffs, and Henry had vanished, buried in a secret no one had uncovered until now. With the truth now in his hands, Ethan knew what he had to do. Clara's spirit would not rest until justice was served. But Lucas Fairchild was long dead, his crimes buried with him. How could he give Clara the peace she needed? The answer lay in the house itself, in the secrets it had kept for all these years. The final piece of the puzzle was waiting to be uncovered. As Ethan stood alone in the attic, the weight of Whitman Manor's past bore down on him, and he realized he wasn't just a bystander in this story. He was now a part of it. And Clara was waiting for him to finish what she had started. The truth weighed heavily on Ethan's mind as he descended from the attic, the final piece of Clara's tragic story unfolding with every step. The realization that Lucas Fairchild had murdered both Clara and Henry was overwhelming. But now, with the letters in hand, he had the proof that had remained hidden for decades. Yet the question lingered. How could he help Clara find peace when her killer had long since passed? Downstairs, Madeline Foster was pacing in the study, waiting anxiously for Ethan's return. As he entered, she looked up, her face a mixture of curiosity and concern. "What did you find?" she asked. Ethan handed her the letters, watching her expression shift from confusion to shock as she read the final words penned by Clara. It was Lucas. He was the one who killed them both. Clara went to warn Henry, but Lucas followed them. That night on the cliffs, it wasn't an accident. Madeline sank into a chair, her eyes wide. All this time, Clara's spirit has been trapped because of Lucas's betrayal. But what can we do now? Lucas is gone. The Fairchild family buried the truth. Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of the task ahead. We need to give Clara and Henry the closure they never had. We need to find Henry's body and tell the world what really happened. The next morning, Ethan and Madeline returned to the cliffs where Clara had fallen to her death. The fog clung to the rocks as they descended the path leading to the base of the cliffs, the ocean crashing against the jagged shoreline. Ethan felt an overwhelming sense of urgency, as if Clara herself was guiding him toward something hidden in the rocks below. They combed the area for hours, searching for any sign of Henry's remains. The cliffs had weathered many storms over the years, but something about this place felt frozen in time. Trapped, just like Clara. As they moved deeper into a cave tucked along the shore, Madeline called out, "Ethan, over here!" He hurried to her side, his heart pounding as he saw what she had found. Beneath a pile of rocks half buried in sand was a set of skeletal remains. Beside them, barely visible through the erosion, was a gold locket engraved with the initials CF. Ethan knelt, carefully lifting the locket. Inside was a small, faded portrait of Clara. Henry had died with it in his hand. "We found him," Ethan whispered, the weight of the discovery heavy in the air. "This is where Lucas hid Henry's body after he killed him." Madeline's voice trembled. Now we can finally tell the truth. Later that evening, Ethan and Madeline prepared to release their findings to the public. With the evidence from the letters and the remains they had uncovered, The truth about Clara and Henry's deaths could no longer be hidden. It was time to expose Lucas Fairchild's crimes and give Clara the justice she had been denied. But as the night grew darker, the atmosphere in Whitman Manor shifted. The house seemed to pulse with energy, as if it too knew that the end was near. Ethan could feel Clara's presence stronger than ever, her spirit restless, awaiting the final act that would set her free. Suddenly, the familiar knocking began again, 3 deliberate taps at the door. But this time, Ethan wasn't afraid. He knew it was Clara, calling to him, urging him forward. He opened the door and stepped into the fog-filled night. There, at the edge of the property, Clara stood, no longer the shadowy, grief-stricken figure she had once been. Her translucent form shimmered in the moonlight, her face soft and calm, no longer twisted by sorrow. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice carrying on the wind, "for finding the truth." Ethan took a step closer. "It's over now. Lucas can't hurt you anymore. You and Henry can finally rest." Clara smiled, the first true smile Ethan had seen from her. As the fog swirled around her, another figure appeared beside her, Henry. His ghostly form emerged from the mist, his hand reaching out for hers. Clara's eyes filled with tears as they touched, their fingers intertwining for the first time in decades. Ethan watched as the two spirits stood together, their love unbroken by the tragedy that had befallen them. The air around them began to glow with a soft, warm light, and the oppressive weight that had filled Whitman Manor for so long began to lift. "We're free now," Clara said, her voice filled with peace. "Thank you, Ethan, for everything." And with that, Clara and Henry's slowly faded into the light, their forms dissolving into the night air. The fog lifted, the wind calmed, and the house, once so filled with darkness, felt lighter than it ever had before. The next morning, Ethan stood outside Whitman Manor, watching as the first rays of sunlight bathed the house in a golden glow. The truth about Clara and Henry had been uncovered, and their spirits had finally found peace. The town of Hollow Creek would soon know the real story, one of love, betrayal, and justice. Madeline joined him on the porch, a sense of calm settling over her. "It's over, isn't it?" Ethan nodded, a bittersweet smile on his face. "Yes, Clara and Henry are finally free." As they turned to leave, Ethan couldn't help but glance back at the house one last time. The shadows that had once haunted its halls were gone, replaced by the warmth of the morning sun. Clara's story had come to an end, but in doing so, it had given Ethan a new understanding of the past and the ghosts that lingered in the corners of history. Whitman Manor stood tall, no longer a house of secrets, but a place where love had triumphed, even in death. This happened not too long ago, maybe a few months back, and it still makes my skin crawl just thinking about it. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon, and I was home alone with my dog, Buster, and 2 of my friend Sam's dogs, Rocky and Luna. Sam had asked me to watch them while he and his girlfriend went on a weekend trip. I figured it would be a nice, relaxing few days, just me, the dogs, and some peace and quiet. The house I live in is a bit isolated, surrounded by a lot of trees. It's an old place, built decades ago, and has this large open loft upstairs that overlooks the living room. I love the house for its character, but sometimes, especially when you're alone, the creaks and groans of an old building can start to play tricks on your mind. That afternoon, I was lounging on the couch, lost in a book, while Buster, Rocky, and Luna napped lazily at my feet. The house was perfectly still, save for the occasional soft sigh or twitch from one of the dogs as they dreamed. It was the kind of peaceful moment that makes you feel like the world has slowed down around you. Out of nowhere, all 3 dogs shot up at the same time, their ears perked and eyes fixated on something upstairs. They bolted toward the staircase, barking furiously as they stared up at the loft. I quickly stood, my heart immediately racing, as the sound of their barks echoed through the house. "What's wrong, guys?" I called out, trying to calm them, but they ignored me completely, their barking relentless. The loft was empty, or at least it should have been. I hadn't been up there all day. I walked toward the stairs cautiously, feeling a strange chill creeping up my spine. The dogs kept barking, growing more frantic, as if something was up there, something only they could see. My eyes scanned the loft area, but there was nothing, just the usual furniture and the large, old window that faced the backyard. Then, just as quickly as they'd started, they quieted down, all 3 dogs now standing stiff, staring up in tense silence. For a moment, the house was eerily quiet again. I exhaled, trying to convince myself it was just the dogs being, well, dogs. Maybe they'd heard a noise outside, a squirrel scurrying by the window, or the groan of an old wooden beam. But before I could fully relax, I heard it. A calm, mocking voice, soft and low, coming from the direction of the loft. Bark! It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't loud, but it was clear, deliberate. The way someone would mimic a dog's bark to get their attention. Except it wasn't playful. It was sinister. The dogs went wild again, barking louder than before, their eyes still locked on the loft as if whatever had spoken was standing right there. My heart pounded in my chest as fear surged through me. That voice wasn't mine, and there was no one else in the house. No one living, anyway. For a split second, I stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, trying to rationalize what had just happened. Maybe it was a neighbor calling out from outside? No, impossible. My nearest neighbor was over a mile away. The voice was inside. It came from the loft. I grabbed the dog's leashes, my hands shaking as I hooked them on one by one. "Come on," I muttered, trying to sound calm even though my voice trembled. "Let's go for a walk." I wasn't going to wait around to figure out what or who was in my house. I hurried them out the front door and didn't look back until we were halfway down the long driveway. The dogs, thankfully, had calmed down a bit once we were outside, but my nerves were still on edge. I kept glancing over my shoulder as if I expected to see someone watching us from one of the windows. The evening walk turned into a much longer one than usual. I wandered through the woods near my house, trying to shake off the creeping dread that clung to me. It wasn't just that I'd heard a voice, there was something about the way it had spoken, so casual, so taunting. Like whatever it was, it knew it had unsettled me. It wanted to. After what felt like hours, I finally returned to the house, hesitantly stepping inside with the dogs in tow. The loft was still there, unchanged, as quiet and empty as it had always been. I double-checked the windows, the locks on the doors, every corner of the house, but everything seemed normal, except for that lingering chill in the air. For the rest of the night, I couldn't bring myself to sit in the living room where I had heard the voice. I locked myself and the dogs in my bedroom, leaving every light in the house on. Needless to say, I didn't get much sleep. The next morning, I called Sam and asked him to pick up his dogs as soon as he got back. I didn't tell him why. I didn't know how to explain what had happened without sounding crazy. I haven't heard that voice again since, but to this day, I avoid looking up at the loft when I'm home alone. Whatever, or whoever, said bark that day, I'm not sure I ever want to find out.